Good morning. It's Charlene Sinjenko from PowHERhouse, and I welcome each of you here this morning. Here we are on September 16th, and we are here for another Gather for Her conversation, and I thank you for being here, whether it's live or through a recording. Gather for Her is our opportunity to dedicate ourselves to the weekly practice of gathering for the purpose of expanding as a group of women, as a group of women leaders, fully into our potential and into all that it means to be a human and what that means to live and lead in 2020 during these times. The collective wisdom that comes out through these conversations is very open and welcomed and intriguing and curious. And when you thread these weekly conversations together into the story of us, there's actually nothing I'd rather be doing. I would like to first acknowledge the ancestral, the traditional and unceded territory that I am hosting Gather for Her on this morning, and that is on the Squamish First Nation lands of the beautiful Sunshine Coast on the west coast of Canada. And I gratefully gather with three other co-hosts this morning. And I'd just like to welcome each of them, maybe starting with Christina, to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. And it's so great to see so many familiar faces, but also a couple new faces. So welcome and thank you for joining us. Shar asked at the beginning, what was our two-word check-in? And I've only got one word check-in this morning, and that's home. And that has so many meanings because I got home at 1 a.m. last night. And so my whole body is happy to be here. So, and I'm joining you from Golden and the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa and the Shuswap. So thanks, Shar.
Good morning. I'm Tina, and I'm here from Nahuelachum on the unceded territory, traditional territory, and unceded traditional territory of the Squamish people. And I feel very full. I can feel I can feel a lot, and I'm blessed to be here, feeling very blessed in this moment.
Good morning. I'm Sharon Marshall, and I'm here in the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw and Snuneymuxw First Nations of the Coast Salish people on Vancouver Island. And my two words are rested and curious. And I'm very excited, and I feel very blessed to be here as well.
Thank you very much. So our theme for this month and likely throughout the fall, we're just waiting for it and watching for it. Our theme is ready for more. And specifically, our theme today is ready for more rest. It's interesting when we think about the word more and what that brings up in us personally. But we're going to bookend the word more. And today it's ready for more rest specifically. I would like to welcome our very special guest this morning, Dr. Shannon Waters. She is a public health and preventative medicine physician. She's a communicator and a bridge walker. She lives and works in her home territory as a medical health officer for this Cowichan Valley on Vancouver Island, and brings a very important Indigenous lens while leading in a Western worldview system in public health. Good morning, Shannon. I'm going to pause there and welcome you this morning. Thank you so much for being here.
Neta, good morning. Ikwanasi Namnala, It's such a honor to see all of you. And yeah, it's just, I guess my 2 words for this morning are repetition and healing, because I hope that through this conversation we can, you know, look at ways that we can repeat rest within our lives to heal ourselves and to heal, you know, everyone around us, including the land, waters, air, animals.
I've had the pleasure, along with my team and each of my co-hosts has met Shannon personally. And I've known Shannon for almost 2 years now. I've had the pleasure of walking beside her as a sister and a leader. And when I was fortunate enough in the last few weeks to receive a podcast that I felt was meant to be shared this morning, I'm not sure how many of you had time to listen to it before. You certainly will be listening to it after, I guarantee you. And the name of the podcast has just been shared in the chat. It's called Rest as Resistance. We're going to be diving into that a little bit further today. And I couldn't think of a better powerhouse to invite to dig into this conversation than Dr. Shannon. And Shannon, I was just wondering if you could tell us, you know, kind of with an overall brushstroke, how a little bit about your approach to health and well-being in how you live and lead in your life.
Sure. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a physician. I'm a mixed race. I'm Coast-Salish, Halkanian on my mother's side, and Swedish and Hungarian and Scottish on my father's side. And I was always drawn to healing growing up, and really, but felt kind of caught between, I guess, 2 worlds. And I did go to Western Academic Medical School, started right after my undergrad, so I was 22, and a lot of the things that were presented to me as truths or based on, you know, the best evidence, I often would kind of look at it from different viewpoints and, you know, ask some questions that not necessarily a whole lot of other people that I was training with were asking questions around. And it was really as I got later on in my training and I got the chance to go out in community outside of hospitals. And I'm not saying I don't appreciate hospitals. Last summer I had my appendix out and I very much appreciate what kind of service they can provide for us. But it was really when I was out in the community that I gained more kind of just understanding of the questions I was asking and where they were coming from. So really, I mean, for myself, as a woman, now a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend, what I really saw as I was going through medical school, which is really important, I think, to the topic we have today, is there was kind of a conditioning that was happening. There was a lot of grueling processes that I had to go through and kind of rites of passage in terms of staying up for 36 hours at a time, trying to provide care for people that were just kind of given as part of the culture, the grind culture that's mentioned within this podcast. And it didn't really honor me or anyone else as physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual beings. And it really, I actually had to take some time as one of my mentors, Dr. Stephen Faulkner, who lives in the community where I'm in, to rest and heal, actually, after I went through my medical school training. And it was in that time when I was asking some questions as to, why did I do this in the first place? Is this the way I should be like bringing forward my gifts in the world? That I realized that, you know, there was no mistake that I had gone through this process, but what could I learn from it and what could I bring to my gifts as a physician? And I did spend some time being a family physician, seeing individuals one-on-one or sometimes families. But what I found after doing that, I was a family physician for just a couple years, is that I became largely frustrated with seeing people after they were already sick and not having a lot of tools to help them be better. And I wanted to help people stay well in the first place. And so that's why I came into this realm, which I'm in now, which is public health and preventative medicine. And it's a real honor, privilege, and challenge now being a public health and preventative medicine physician in my home territory. So I really am representing a Western colonial system, and in the podcast it talks about how medicine itself is a colonial system. I am a representative of that, while also being an Indigenous woman and having, you know, a more inclusive perspective than I think often the Western system is ready for or is aware of. So yeah, that's where I've ended up, and I really appreciate this role. And I'll also say around the topic today, being a public health and preventative medicine physician in the time of an opioid crisis, in the time of pandemic, in a time when we can't go outside because there's too much smoke in the air, really becomes overwhelming, and you know, really makes you think. Like sometimes I can feel like if only I would stay up, you know, I have a 20-hour workday, I could do the most that I could to help protect health for people in my community. But I think that's why, you know, this topic right now resonates to me so well, because it's especially in times of crisis that we really need to remember that we need to rest and look after ourselves and each other.
One of the things, and I'd like to kind of ask my co-host to join me on this, because they've all also had the pleasure of you know, doing some work with you, of meeting you, of interacting with you. But I know that your top 3 priorities in health and how you approach health, and correct me or adjust me if I'm off a little, but you know, your approach to health is not only maternal health, ourselves and our families, but also mental health and planetary health. And I think we're finally starting to see, you know, understand in the mainstream how those 3 things are so interrelated. And I think for many years as we grew up, we held them apart. And even in this podcast, you could see as they were speaking how one thing played into the other. And I wanted to just kind of open up with our first question about that more holistic, but all inclusive. It isn't only, you know, taking care of our health so we don't get sick, or taking care of our family, or taking care of our mental well-being, or taking care of our planet. And Dr. Shannon, I know you've been asked to speak quite regularly on our interrelationality with those 3 pieces. So I just wanted you to speak to that a bit, and I encourage my co-host to jump in and start to dig in on that topic.
Sure. I have the pleasure of having my chief medical health officer that I work for really, you know, trusts us as a team of 5 to come up with our own approaches or priorities in the work that we do. So yeah, Shar, what you were mentioning is the personal priorities I've come up with for the Cowichan Valley region, which I work with, but also my approach to, you know, all the work that I do. And so I am the medical health officer who's got the portfolio for climate change and for water as well. And my priorities are linked to something I'll be speaking about later around a walk that I undertook that retraced some steps of my ancestors. And they're kind of 3 pillars. So one is connection to the land. And when I say land, I think in Indigenous languages, when we say the word land, it's more inclusive than what a lot of, I guess, English language ideas are around land. I'm really meaning the whole of the environment. So to our territory, to the animals, to the plants, to the water, like our connection to that is one of my pillars, because I think what we're seeing with climate change and biodiversity collapse is ultimately, you know, related to our loss of connection to the land. Then also my second pillar is around mental wellness. And the third is maternal, child, and family health. Now, I think the climate change and biodiversity collapse is like the most potent threat to our health. Our mental health, our mental wellness is where we have the highest burden across the board in my community, across the province, across the country. If you look at, chronic conditions, mood, anxiety disorders, number one types of conditions. And then maternal, child, and family health. Well, I think this is where we have the highest return on our investment. If we put effort, focus, love, care in those areas, we really will have the most benefit. So in my days that can seem crazy busy, I really try and focus down to those three areas. And as long as I'm pulling the thread through of one of those things, and some people think they're very disparate, or they say like, oh, that seems all over the map, but they're really very connected, and any benefit we have in any one of those areas is going to have ripple effects elsewhere. That's really how I try and, pare down my days when they seem crazy is, am I working in one of these areas? Because if I am, I know it's going to have ripple effects elsewhere.
Shannon, I just wanted to, I wanted to kind of dig into what you just said there, and that is, how do you, because our default setting, right, is going to be to continue to just worship busyness and worship doing. And so we all know these, they touch our heart. We know them not only intellectually, but they resonate in our body. How do you, can you provide us some really tangible ways that you model that in your life, even just with switching your thinking?
Well, I think really for me, one of the ways I've been able to do this, and it's really been a practice, let me say, and really through being in networks such as, PowHERhouse here and working with people like Charlene, just to really help us, especially as women, because we have so many other roles we play as aunties, sisters, mothers, in some cases, grandmothers. We want, our capacity for what we want to care for and love is immeasurable. And so really what helped me was really focusing down on what my gifts were, and what my gifts, what my priorities are, what really I was going to be able to bring forth through acting in my gifts. So really finding those three priorities for myself gave me the permission that if something else was going on and if I couldn't find the link to it, I could let that go, knowing that that was someone else's work. Not everything is my work. And, when I'm working within my gifts, the best of my capability, that is when my energy is the most efficient. And I think especially in times like these, we need to be efficient, and we need to pull on each other, and everyone else being in their own gifts as best as they can.
That's gold right there. Not everything is my work. How much time do we spend in our areas of competency and not in our zones of genius? So that's pure gold. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Something I want to pull a thread out that you said, Shannon, and that connects back to rest as resistance. When you were talking about family, and then you were talking about the land, and when you talked about the land, and you talked about it and you used the word inclusive, and then you went over to family, I was like, she's actually, what I heard is family, not family land. It was like family. I'm like, wow. And then when I heard it from that place and I connected back to rest as resistance, what I know about my own awareness in connecting to land is everything slows down. And then I was like, ooh, is like, imagine if it was that simple. If just by connecting to land, or just by connecting, and I actually want to take the word just out because it almost diminishes it. So by connecting to land and connecting to family, that we might find rest as the great hand that holds us. I was listening to a book launch this week from Seth Klein, and one of the things that he said was that in the very beginning was to address the climate crisis. If all we did was start with a land acknowledgement, so much of the work begins. And I think that's what you're speaking to. I wonder if that takes you anywhere around rest and family and single focus or simplicity. Does that take you anywhere?
Yeah. It makes me think of a thread I've been trying to speak to more within my work. And let me say, this isn't per se at this point endorsed by Island Health, the organization I work with. But I really have been speaking to the importance of looking at our environment. So the plants, the animals, the water, the rocks, the air, especially the last number of days, as part of our health system. And we need to value it as part of our health system. When we think of health, often we think of hospitals or a physician visit or medications, and especially during this time of COVID, where we've had to really slow down, move inward. I have had so much gratitude that I'm living in my home territory where we have so much access. You can probably see out here, trees in behind me. There was some times when we were in more lockdown where I was, talking with our municipality, and there was questions around like, do we close the local trails? And I was like, I think it's really important we have ways to support ourselves mentally, emotionally, and spiritually right now. There are ways we can access the outdoors, in safe manner. And that is really critical to us keeping well, to keeping our resilience, in this difficult time. So I think, and also our environment, our peoples, like a lot of Indigenous groups will speak to the plants as peoples, to the waters as peoples. Like, and in my role as a medical health officer, helping to protect the health of the region within I work with all the peoples, not just the human peoples. So really, I think that's, just becomes so much more visible, I think, now when we're in crisis, and it becomes so much more important when we're in crisis.
Shannon, I just question for you. How easy is it for you to even talk about the land as peoples to an organization like Island Health? Coming from an Indigenous person, and our Indigenous views, how easy is that to discuss that and from a health perspective?
It's becoming easier. And let me just say, I don't even think 5 years ago, well, I wouldn't have been as bold in saying it 5 years ago as I would be now. And I think the importance is becoming more and more apparent to me as time goes on, and the fear or apprehensions I might have had in terms of, I think, speaking to this podcast as well, like kind of grind culture, colonial systems. Like, I am here in this colonial system right now, but I'm not attached to it. I'm not attached to being a medical health officer. I have the opportunity to do so. And really, I think speaking these things are what I've determined is one of my gifts in terms of what my 3 priorities are. So I will do that. And Shar and I have had some of these conversations where, like, I have to be okay with the fact that, at a certain point that might not be very comfortable for the organization or some other people that I work with. But I think, given the multiple crises we see, going on simultaneously, I think more and more people are curious and listening.
Yeah, and I love how you talked about being bold, and I think that that's an act of resistance, right? That was such a good question, Sharon. That's an act of resistance to start speaking truth, even when it's really when there's a risk and it's uncomfortable. It's the only way to sort of reach the tipping point, I think. Yeah, that's again more gold.
I'd love to actually segue if I could. I don't want, this has been an amazing kind of overall context. I'd love to dive into the actual podcast because I believe it was gifted. It didn't come, it was no mistake. It landed on my lap through an Indigenous organization. And just to give folks a tiny bit of context, whether you've listened to it or you haven't yet, what most struck out, and the speaker, I want to make sure and give Tricia Hersey the credit. This is all Sleep as Resistance is her movement, and the podcast is called the produced podcast is on a podcast series called For the Wild. So what most it was a brand new concept for me, and it really was sleep as resistance. I lovingly renamed it for myself, sleep as a form of reconciliation in action. So how am I modeling what I do? Because that's the only thing I have control over, what I do and who I am being, and how does sleep play into that? So it was a bit of a wake-up call for me as someone who prides herself in productivity, work ethic, discipline, up at the crack of dawn, prides herself. And I started to recognize other Indigenous females in my network with similar work ethics. And I was like, am I imagining this? And then I listened to the podcast. It was all about the colonialistic view of productivity and the hustle and the grind and the go, and that was very much ingrained in us, and that if we carry that through in our lifetime and teach that to our children and our grandchildren, that we are disrespecting our elders. We're disrespecting the work that has been done. And so honestly, on a very personal level, it was a huge slap in the face. It was a huge wake-up call. It was actually a shake. And that's when I reached out to Dr. Shannon and said, okay, we need to talk about this. And Dr. Shannon, I'm just wondering if you could speak to, when you listen to the podcast, from who you are and how you lead and what you're all about in your work, what most came out for you? How did it affect you?
Thanks. And I'll say just a little anecdote here about Charlene. I often refer to her as pleasantly persistent. And I think we all need those pleasantly persistent people in our lives. And so she had sent me a Voxer, like, with the link to the podcast, and she's like, I think you should listen to this. And COVID, overdose crisis, I was like, whatever. And I think I looked at it again, and you sent me another reminder. And somehow one of the days I found some space, like she said, it was an hour and 10 minutes. And so I went outside for a walk and I listened to it. And yeah, my mind was blown. And really what struck me was the whole aspect of the podcast, but I'll speak to just even within the first couple minutes. Tricia speak to, this work really came out of communicating with her ancestors. And so she's someone whose ancestors had worked on slave plantations in the southern US. And that communicating with ancestors just really brought me to my own personal experience that I had through my work, my life, and how there was such a lesson of rest in there as well. And I'll say just really briefly a bit more about that. So I, in work, had gotten into, you know, a challenging place. I was in an organization that many of us have probably been in the past, where it was a pretty unhealthy organization, quite toxic actually. I was, I think, being a bit targeted because I was a strong woman leader. And it actually ended up that I ended up leaving that organization suddenly and without an escape route, without another role to go right into. And so that was really jarring for me and my family. I was the primary breadwinner. We had also just recently moved. And I had a mentor who spoke to me a number of times throughout that time period. And I was just trying to like lean into and find the trust that this was what was meant to be and things were gonna work out. And she had asked me maybe to look into my origin stories. And so it's Cowichan people. We have an ancestral story and it's called Those Who Fell from the Sky. And the first men fell from the sky into our territory. Smoke, you can't see it, but they fell, the mountain is behind me, Swakas, one of the mountains where they fell at the base of the mountain. And the story goes that they walked and they got to know the land. And after some time, some women who were further away from here, Sauk or Souk, for those who might know that area on the island, they walked to meet the men in Cowichan, and they came together and formed the Cowichan peoples. And there was quite a bit in the story about the men and their journeys, and we knew their names. And the women in the story, we didn't know their names. And I read about 5 or 6 different versions of this story. One is our Cowichan tribes version that has been written up. And we didn't know, you know, how the journey was, what route they took. And I was really mad. At that moment, I was mad because I was like, why do we know so much about the men's story and not the women's story? And, you know, and in talking to a few different people, some mentors, some elders, you know, I got some, you know, possible answers. One was, you know, perhaps the anthropologists in most cases who heard the story, heard the woman's story and didn't care about it, so they didn't record it. Perhaps the mostly men who had been interviewed, it wasn't their place to tell the woman's story, so they didn't speak of it. And then the third one was perhaps it was an invitation for me to walk from Souk to Cowichan myself and make that story my own. And once I saw that, like I couldn't unsee it. And it was a little edgy, but I, you know, started talking to some friends and started looking at what the route may be, and turned out, you know, in and around me and my good friend's 40th birthdays, we walked that journey. I was trying to get pregnant before this had all happened, and I got pregnant in the planning of that journey, which is not lost on me. And it was mapped out to basically kind of be 5 days. And one of the days we were going to be walking through the Souk Lake watershed. And it was at that time a locked, gated area. And I had to write a letter to the Capital Regional District to ask for access to the watershed, explaining a little bit, you know, what we wanted to do. And it was edgy because I was like, geez, you know, am I going to get this permission? Which I did. And so the first day of our journey, we got to Souk Lake potholes, and the second day, and it was, the first day was grueling. I was carrying a backpack. We woke up, we're kind of sore. The second day, we were gonna get to the gate of the watershed. It was locked, and we didn't have someone coming until the following morning to let us in. And we walked 2 kilometers. And it was like, you know, when you're tenting, you're not sleeping in, it's not necessarily the most comfortable sleeping on the ground. So we got to the gate at 10 a.m. And we're like, okay, we found it. I guess we'll go back and make our campsite. And I felt like I had this real reaction, like, this is wrong. I had this vision that my ancestors, these women, were superhuman. They did this walk in like, you know, an unfathomable short amount of time. They were, you know, fast. They were, you know, all these ideas I had. And then I sat down by the river on a beautiful sunny day with my friend, and we decided we would make dream catchers out of, you know, the twigs and twine that she had brought. And we swam in the river. And suddenly it dawned on me that my ancestors didn't make a superhuman feat. They took their time. They rested. They reveled in the beauty around them. They reveled in who they were walking with. And that was such an important part for me of that journey. I speak to the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of that walk. And the physical aspect of that walk for me was about rest. And in listening to this podcast, because this was a teaching from my ancestors that I've not forgotten, it was interesting in listening to the podcast, I realized that was my ancestors telling me how to resist the grind culture, you know, the colonial system I was working within, and the white supremacy that has become so apparent to us in this time frame. So it just really, like, you know, it opened up. It was a repetition through another woman's learnings of how important rest is for us. And quite honestly, if I hadn't had a locked gate in front of me, I might not have taken that rest. But it was it's something I carry with me, you know, always. And it was such a good model of our ways of Indigenous teachings in terms of repetition and rhythm. And when those messages come back to you, in terms of listening to this podcast and hearing it and feeling it again.
I'm curious, Shannon, thank you for that beautiful visual of the story, so we could actually experience moments of it with you, and which I think is where my question is. And I want to name our current story of rest, probably from the colonial thinking, which is rest so that. I will rest so that I. And what I'm hearing in the word reveling and in the when you shared that moment of something's wrong, this is wrong. It was like what I'm listening for is what is our new story of the word rest, and then you use the word rhythm, and I wonder if, like, when I think about rest as maybe I'm answering your question for that I'm asking you now, but I think what I'm asking you is, what do you think our new story of rest is? If it's not equational, which is really all that we understand right now, we're between stories right now. Like, what do you think our new story of rest is?
Tricia spoke to something in the podcast which really resonated with me as well. She spoke to rest being an ethos or a perspective that is slowed down and connected. She's done a lot of work with people taking collective naps. Like, you know, I've had different women I've worked with talk about, you know, sometimes they'll just take a nap when they need and, you know, are stuck on something. And, I was like, wow, you know, I never considered that. But, I think in terms of that, it's naps, and it's a different approach to our life and our days, that ethos, that perspective of being slowed down and connected. I have a dear friend who's on this call right now who really has been such a model for me of that different perspective on life and what your days mean and what it means to be slowed down and connected. I have a dear aunt who's now passed, who I wrote an article about. She had scleroderma. She was not predicted to live. She lived 7 years longer than anyone ever predicted her to live. And she was such a model of, she used to talk to me about letting go of the fast-paced life. And at that point, I didn't even really know what that meant. But it was just her gentle way of saying, like, slow down, niece, slow down. And I think really when Tricia mentioned in the podcast about connected, I was like, yes, like that is also what the connection to the land and my the priorities I'm looking at in my work means. Like, like you said, Tina, in just that connection, your pace changes. And so I really try and cultivate that now in my days, especially when we're dealing with opioid crisis, pandemic, forest fires, climate change. Like, you can get caught up in a whirlwind, and in making that connection, you can get through the next moment, then the next minute, then the next hour, and the days. And so really that's how I kind of approach that. I will say one of the very practical things that I've been trying to do in my life, which didn't happen in the beginning of COVID, March, April, May, because really with so much uncertainty, we weren't really allowed to take days off, which, let me say, took a toll on me for sure. But one of the things I've been doing is structuring, creating a rhythm of connection and rest within my life. And so what that's mean for me quite practically over this last year is that I take time off. And for me, being addicted to grind culture, I would save up my holidays. I would be on a teleconference in the airport, 3 minutes until my plane took off, because I was gonna work right up to the last minute and make sure I was maximizing my, vacation time. And I would fly back sometimes in the morning and go right to work. And like, oh my gosh, like my body had no rest in that. Like, vacation was not rest. Vacation was achieving, doing things, going places. And now what I've done is really just looked at, the days off I have and have scheduled in regular, and being a woman and, just looking at what's around me and rhythms out there that I can connect to. I've really looked at taking the full moon and the new moon off every month if it's on a work day, just for myself. When my kids are at school or daycare, other things are happening, and I have that day. And at first it almost felt to me like a waste. And then I realized it was so important. It wasn't a waste of a day. It was actually creating so much more capacity for me as a woman, a human being, that it's just something I can't say, like, I would never go back now. No one's really caught on yet within my organization, the days I take off, but also when it's a day here or there. I think because when you take a week off, which I still do at points, can be so much that's built up while you're gone. But if you take a day, not too much builds up, and you create that rhythm of rest and pause within your life.
Yeah, I can't help but think of slow down or you will be slowed. I want to actually extend an invitation to the larger group to think about what, because you use the word permission a couple times, and just what an invitation. And so for the larger group, when you're journaling, think about, what do I need to give myself permission to do, and what's the invitation? What is the invitation for me? Because if we don't personalize this, we will, like I said, if we don't slow down, we will be slowed down. And so this conversation is, again, it's easy to intellectualize the concepts, and it's a completely another thing to do it. So the taking that invitation and personalizing it, that's going to be sort of my challenge to the group. Shar.
And I would like to actually kind of walk us into a group discussion, because I don't want to cut us short. I'm going to formally end our recorded part of this conversation with Dr. Shannon, and thank you for being part of just this fabulous conversation.